Welcome everyone to today's webinar. So this is the first in a two-part series on programmatic native advertising, and today we're covering opportunities and challenges that exist for both buy and sell side stakeholders. So we've got some great experts from our members for today's panel, which is going to last around 40-45 minutes. And we've got a great moderator, Liam Brennan from Mediacom. And before I hand over to Liam, I'm just going to quickly run through a couple of housekeeping points for everyone. So you will notice that all attendees are on mute by default. This is just to ensure the best sound experience for everyone. So if you do have questions for the panelists, you can submit these via the Q&A box, which is on the right-hand side of your screen in the GoToWebinar control panel. And we'll try and answer as many as possible of those as we can. If you have any technical issues or other queries, then please send those through the chat box, which I will be monitoring. Both chat and Q&A box are on the right-hand side of the control panel. The session is being recorded, so you'll be able to share and watch back afterwards. We do have a short survey at the end of the webinar, so if you do have time to complete that, that would be great, just to help us shape future webinars and events. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Liam Brennan, our moderator for today, who is going to take us through the panel and ask the panelists to introduce themselves. So Liam, over to you, if you can hear us okay.
Three great panelists joining us today. I'll let them all introduce them because I'm sure they could do a much better job than I can, but let's start with Agathe first.
Hi everyone, so I'm Agathe from Outbrain. I'm in charge of the programmatic business on the buy side at Outbrain for the past 2 years, and I think I'm a kind of native expert, as I've been with Outbrain for 8 years, focusing on the traditional native business in South Europe for 6 years and switching to programmatic in the recent times. Very happy to be part of this panel.
Great, thanks for joining us, Agathe. Thanks for being on. And let's move on to Terrance.
Hi, I'm Terrance Robinson. I'm head of ad technology for BBC Global News. My team are responsible for the commercial systems that allow the transaction of digital advertising on BBC's international output, which encompasses a whole myriad of different things, including programmatic and native. We've been working with a handful of native partnerships for the last couple of years, primarily for the purpose of programmatic backfill, but we also use it for direct execution only.
Great, and lucky last, Jeremy.
I'll be glad to take that spot. Hello, everybody. My name is Jeremy. I head up the global programmatic business at Tabula. My team is charged with onboarding and managing DSPs, as well as partnering with sales organization to drive successful programmatic partnerships for holding companies and agencies. A little bit, I feel obliged to talk about why I'm so excited about Programmatic Native, and I just love the fact that it's a non-intrusive format that gives the user an opportunity to discover more things. And so I'm super excited to be part of this panel and talk to you all today.
Right, and it's great to have you on, Jeremy. I'm going to go have a quick whip through everyone's POV in a second on Programmatic Native, but I'm Liam. Hopefully this is I was talking through this when I got cut off before, but I'm Liam Brennan. I'm the Global Director of Innovation at Mediacom. I used to do a lot of digital buying, and actually the last few days, actually talking to the guys on the call has been a real eye-opener to see actually how far the Programmatic Native conversation has moved on in the last couple of years. We've got a really great panel going from buy side to sell side. So I wanted to ask some of the panelists, what is their definition of programmatic native advertising? How does it differ from traditional sort of display advertising? Agathe, you're working on the buy side. What's your opinion on that?
So, great definition of like native programmatic, I think, is first a result of a lot of evolution on the advertising market in the past 10 years, where the native industry has been really growing for many years as a closed walled garden, in the traditional and direct business way. And as it comes to a huge opportunity and alternative to giants like Google and Facebook, the duopoly, I think it's not surprising that this industry is going to programmatic the same way that display has been shifting into programmatic many years ago now, but increasingly and now reaching a percentage close to 100%. I think it's really good to see the native industry doing the same shift, as there is a big need from the advertisers and the industry to actually scale in an efficient way and capitalize on the evolution of the industry and for their business. So I think it's a very good evolution of the industry, and we will position the native as the place for user and audience to discover things that they never knew about it, and the best way to understand it is to see the opposite of search, where people go and search for what they're looking for. So I think it's the very good non-intrusive advertising format that the audience are actually looking after, and explaining why there's such a shift from the advertiser agency and entire digital advertising industry. So really exciting to see Programmatic Native growing as a true native believer.
Right, and Terrance, as someone that's working on the other side of the fence, how do you see the programmatic native space, and particularly from the BBC angle?
Yeah, I mean, I think native is a fantastic opportunity. When you take a look at our audience numbers, what we have seen in obviously in recent years is this proliferation of different screen sizes, particularly with the dominance of mobile and tablet. I mean, non-desktop now represents 2/3 of our inventory. So when you're dealing with an audience like that, your ad real estate becomes incredibly fragmented, and it becomes quite difficult to have to weigh a decent user experience, as well as with a slick ad execution that looks good. So I think really native fits that niche very well.
Great, and Jeremy, the programmatic native space, and my experience has always been when I was buying was sort of signing off IOs and doing things in a more traditional way. What do you see as the key difference between the programmatic native space and the more insertion order, more static, normal booked way of doing business when it comes to native? What are the challenges and opportunities you see?
Well, I think just to separate just the differences straight off out of the gate. Let's talk about native display. Traditionally bought on a CPC, just like social or search native, if we want to bucket those together. Programmatic native display is bought on a CPM, so that's the first thing to sort of to realize and understand the difference. And then you have to talk about the creative execution itself. So it's not just an ad tag that you traffic and optimize toward clicks or viewable impressions or something like that. You have to look at the images, the headlines, and the branding text, and create a few combinations that may have worked on social and put them into the open web, and then lean into the combinations of creatives that are working best. So those are probably two of the biggest differences. And then just understanding that the metrics, the performance is going to be driven by that combination of image, headline, and branding text.
And I'll throw another question back to Agat, if that's okay. I mean, one thing is that as an agency, when I'm looking at programmatic native, it's a real interesting mix of placement, creative, and messaging. How has that changed how you as Outbrain have operated? Because one of the things I think that's always a challenge for programmatic is making sure that your message matches where it appears on the website.
So it's true that it was, let's say, it's easier in the traditional native to control how the ads will appear, because as you work with only one native partner, you know better exactly the creative assets to provide, including a headline or a description. With the programmatic, it sounds that like the promise is that you can actually run the same native creative across all the native SSPs in the market. But I think this is actually one of the biggest challenges nowadays, as the beauty of native is that it's not standardized, but it's also a very big challenge because there are some differences in the format. And so the industry needs to get educated about the specificities, I think, of the different native SSPs and pay attention a lot more to actually how the ads are rendered and how they show on the publisher. So this is we have tools, and I think the industry is improving this part, but it's still one of our biggest challenge. And there's one differentiation from traditional to programmatic native that I think we haven't mentioned so far is about the targeting. I think what's been a very key difference for us shifting to programmatic is we used to have our kind of magic algorithm that was doing, on our own ad server, the targeting, trying to maximize performance for advertiser or enrich the best engagement or CTR, etc. And it was always a little bit the black box. And now with programmatic, we need to give back the power and the flexibility to the buyer to actually recreate the best targeting possible to reach their performance. And everybody in the industry has to learn more and get better at actually reaching performance as good as the proprietary algorithm technology that most native companies used to have for the traditional native.
Yeah, some good points. And I think one thing that certainly comes up when it comes to not just generally how programmatic is particularly native advertising is the importance of different skills required to actually implement some of these campaigns. I know certainly from an agency perspective, you can't just have the programmatic people sitting in isolation buying the media when it comes to native advertising. You really have to work upstream with the planners and the creative teams on your account to make that happen. Jeremy, I mean, do you see a different skill set being required to make programmatic native work most effectively? And if so, what are the sort of new roles and structures that are different that you've seen?
Well, I don't know if it's a different skill set for programmatic native, or perhaps a current skill set that is moved to programmatic native, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So when I look at search and social, that's biddable media, and there are teams that are writing copy and putting images with headlines and things like that. And so perhaps it's just moving the programmatic native to be under the responsibility of your search and social teams versus the traditional programmatic team. So I think the skill set's there. It's just is it being utilized in the right way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. And Jeremy, obviously on the sell side of things, I mean, do you see some of the better campaigns using different structures, or have you seen a best practice emerge from people you're working with, or do you sort of disagree with the fact we need something a little bit different for native?
I think it's tough to really tell because each group, each agency is handling it just a little bit differently. We see success on when there is a lot of when there's some attention paid to the copy and the images and the just putting that together. So at Tabula, we provide a tool called Tabula Trends that will enable planners or traders to tweak what their headlines and branding text is to help them be more successful. So I think it's just a matter of that bit of attention and knowing that it's not a display ad and look at the CTR or the cost, but look at the elements that the buyer has control of, which is the branding text, image, and headline.
Yep, totally agree. I think it's when it comes to sort of the brands that we work with, for example, to get the real sort of right creative that fits with the certain types of media you're buying, it's certainly a structural challenge for lots of agencies and how they operate. And one thing that we've certainly come to the fore is the importance of some of the media partners we work with and actually enabling that to happen. So partners have creative services that's particularly appealing to an agency because a lot of the heavy lifting can be taken off, but also speeds up the process, which is quite useful. Agat, you mentioned before about native advertising and sort of some of the different KPIs that you were working for from a buyer perspective. I'd like to just open the question up to the whole panel really and talk about native advertising and KPIs and actually how measurement works. Obviously, we're all from different sides of different parts of the programmatic spectrum here. But how do you see your campaigns being held to effectiveness, and what is the most common ways of measuring from some of the campaign work that you're seeing? Maybe I'll start with I'll go back to Agat and start the question there.
Thank you. I think it's probably the most important point actually in this whole like the skill set, the education, the way actually a programmatic native should work should really start from the KPIs, because the creatives should be adapted to the KPIs, etc. So there is a real shift on the engagement KPIs, and it goes from like very upper to mid funnel to really down closer to the conversion KPI. So it can go from engagement on site, page view per visit, non-bounce rate, all the way down to a conversion. Brands and agency would value a lot like traffic on high value pages, such as for a car buyer or automobile buyer, it would be a car configurator or a lead generation form. And I think really from the very start of the campaign, from the creatives, this has to be taken in account, because in native, we don't only want to drive a high CTR, which in a way is not that complicated to do. You do a very catchy headline and a catchy image. What you want to drive, it's a click, so a good CTR, but mostly a high engagement down to the page where you want the user to go, and this has to be driven by the creative. So the KPIs are extremely important, and one of the biggest challenge we see with programmatic, with like the shift to programmatic, is the viewability, the importance of viewability and of the impression in the traditional programmatic industry, with like for instance, certain threshold of viewability to reach, etc. Where actually in native we care much less about the impression, but really we start to care from the click and on everything that happened after. So they really a big need to adapt the KPIs for native programmatic in the programmatic industry.
Right, that's a great answer. I'm going to come back to some of the quality metrics in a second and talk more. But Terrance, what are your thoughts on measurement?
Yeah, I think a metric that I'm always interested in is how did the ad actually render to the end user? Because when you're dealing with a format which is quite fluid and can serve on a multitude of different devices and etc. I'm always quite interested in what was the end user experience look like. And I mean, at the moment, those kind of when I say that, I mean things like what was the aspect ratio of the ad, what was the height and width, how many, what was the character count of the title, and things like that. So it's, are we serving our advertisers in the best way possible? Does that then mean that if we're serving an ad in a certain way, do we need to go back and restyle things? So that's a metric that I would be quite keen on seeing.
Again, Terrance, what are your thoughts? Oh, sorry, Jeremy.
Yeah, no worries. So I agree with Agat on the taking the creative in mind, but at Tabula we do something a little bit differently. As I agree that the click is what we should be looking at, the performance. If we look at the auto configurator as an example, but what we've done at Tabula is we've said, okay, this makes sense. The user is reading their article and they get to the Tabula placement. And what we've done is we've said this is the moment of next, and instead of billing on a click, which you can't do in programmatic, obviously, we bill on a viewable CPM. So for us, it's more of a education piece, because if a buyer is buying Tabula, they'll see that the viewability is aligned with being at the bottom of the article. But in reality, it's 100% viewable, because we're not firing the billable event until the ad is at least 50% in view. And so for us, it's more of adapting to what the industry is already looking at and measuring versus being this outlier. So that's, I think, a different take on how we've handled that space from a programmatic perspective.
Great. I think there was something that was a certain bit of a common thread throughout all the answers there, was talking about the importance of quality, making sure that ads are viewable, they render correctly. I think all these things are, from an agency, from a brand perspective, all incredibly important. But again, when you were talking through your answers, you talked through a lot of different ways that we could be measuring native programmatic in terms of clicks, conversions, et cetera, when you're all working to running your native programmatic campaigns, are you being briefed on actually working more towards business outcomes, or are you still finding that native advertising is really held to more traditional metrics, i.e., are we delivering viewable impressions, let's say? Again, I'll throw it back to you.
So I think the good native programmatic or not campaigns are always the one with like engagement KPIs, because like as the definition of native is like where we get to the audience and we let them discover the next thing they want to discover about, and our placement and everything is falling into that. So I think there's always like more like multiple KPIs, and it could be even a viewability rate. Brand safety can be about that, and there's often like multiple engagement KPIs. Can start even from reaching a specific CPC down to any type of high value action. The advertiser often talk about scoring, and they give like a certain scoring card about with like a highest rate for specific KPIs they value more than others, like CPC, etc. So it's usually pretty complex KPI system, let's say, the measurement.
Great. And Terrance, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, from a campaign KPI perspective, we don't really see too much different from traditional media. It's yeah, by and large the same. Yeah.
Good answer. And Jeremy, anything you want to add?
No, I think I would just say that at the end of the day, all advertisers have some measure of success that's outside of what a supply partner might see. So I think for us, it's looking at how do we best deliver the right audience and the right format at a metric that is easily slotted into, let's just say, an Excel sheet to be easily compared. Of course, we want to take in those back-end metrics and try to drive successful outcomes, but just getting that baseline so we're not an outlier that has this extra work to be evaluated amongst everyone else.
I think that's a really important point, actually. And I think, you know, often when you have formats that are so flexible, you know, they're not your standard 30-second video advertising. You can have death by data and optimize the wrong thing. And certainly what I'm seeing when it comes to native, I mean, yes, you'll have a lot of brands trying to tell stories either in contextual environments, but still you'll have some brands still looking purely at acquisition. And this is not just a native thing, but certainly with all media, and I'm the media agency guy is saying this, is that KPIs are the most important thing. And if you know what you need to measure against, you know what to optimize against and know what to buy that's appropriate. And I think that's certainly what's very interesting to me about native, is that, you know, you can do so many different things that perhaps you can't do with a 300 by 250. I'm going to jump back to Terrance again and talk about some challenges, and mainly the implementation of native ads. Obviously, they're not a standard ad unit, a little bit more tricky to get working on your properties. What are some of the challenges that you're facing at the moment, or you've faced in the past?
Yeah, I mean, Agath touched on this earlier around the lack of standardization. I would completely echo that. I mean, I think there's a distinct lack of a framework in terms of when it comes to handling the asset delivery, and almost feel a bit like as if asset delivery needs to be stripped away from the actual creative rendering. So if you take a look at kind of the BBC's, take BBC as an example and what our rollout looked like. I mean, we've got hundreds of different page templates across our various different sections. On top of that, we have to support, over a dozen or so different browsers and browser versions. And on top of that, our website operates on about 6 different breakpoints from across all the different devices. So what that means is that we have to build, test, and continually support thousands of different types of scenarios. And we have to do that for each individual partner because we have to do bespoke deployments for each. So this starts to become a bit of a problem because it kind of inhibits the amount of partners that you can work with. But it also means that you have to weigh up your resource versus the revenue. So you only ever end up really with, from an inventory coverage perspective, just sticking it on a couple of your biggest channels. Or, I mean, the flip side to that is you generally just stick your native creative into a fixed display ad like an MPU, which kind of undermines really some of the benefits of running native in the first place. So, I mean, I think from a publisher perspective, I think having a framework that just handles the almost like on a macro level where the actual rendering is handled by the publisher or deployed through the ad server, but there's a common framework that all partners work to, where you can dynamically insert the assets like the image and the title tag. That would dramatically increase the scale on our end.
Yeah, so it's a good point on the scale question. I think, again, I'm going to jump back to you in a second, but certainly from an advertiser perspective for us as an agency, reach and scale become incredibly important. Often we see fantastic creative executions or opportunities, but then our brands we want to work with ultimately want to reach their entire audience, and that can often be an inhibitor to working in a certain way, at least for brands that are trying to go mass. Agath, what are some of the challenges you're seeing from an advertiser perspective to using Programmatic Native?
So I think the biggest challenge we have is that a display-centric industry and a community of display experts are now shifting to native, and we need a lot of education of the entire industry on what are the KPIs for native, how to execute creatives, campaigns, optimization, etc. And we need an improvement on the tools that actually are being used. So the traditional DSPs of the industry, like AppNexus, The Trade Desk, DV360, have been built for display, and even the business model still being CPM driven, even if there's some beta tests starting on each of them to start CPC buy. Those platforms are really made to buy display efficiently and focus on impression and audience, and which is very different from the objectives of native, where we target engagement and specific users. So I think we need an evolution of the tools, and this will help educate the entire market. And I think that's why as well we are seeing an entire industry of native specific tools actually emerging. There's some native DSPs like Zemonta and others, which are much more integrated and efficient to execute native compared to the existing tools. So there's going to be an interesting evolution of this market on that side as well.
That's it's a good point. I think certainly you'll see when you start seeing tools that make life easier for brands and agencies to sort of jump in and do something differently, you see a real uptake in how things are done. I think from a typical media agency, going to blame the creative agency here, but one of the biggest challenges I think we've had with new units and new opportunities always been how can you introduce that new creative opportunity in amongst your typical 30-second spot or your IAB standard units. And I think the more, and to Jeremy's point before about his, the ability for Tabula to make their own credit for agencies, these are the sort of things that makes life easier, I think, and opens up more brands to using these types of tools and ways of working. I'm going to wrap up some of the panelists' questions in about 10 minutes, but if anyone wants to ask any questions of the panelists, do write a question in the GoToWebinar box, and then we'll throw it out to the team in about 5 to 10 minutes. But before I do that, Jeremy, some of the challenges that we've heard from Terrance, Agat, and myself, some seem like easy fixes, some seem like complicated fixes. What are your thoughts on some of the ways that we can fix some of these problems, or indeed embrace some of the opportunities that native programmatic offers?
Well, I think it's this balance of is it a need for a bunch of smaller players to offer the tools that allow the ease and use of native, or is it adapting to what the omni-channel DSPs need? So I think it's a function of chicken and egg. So omni-channel DSPs, as we've seen over the last year, become more interested, and this is due to brands and agencies becoming more interested in native display. And so as this happens, we can look at MediaMath last year launching their native workflow. We're seeing more happen. And so from Tabula's perspective, we want to make it easy for a buyer to transact with native. We know that the value of native display is there because it is at that moment of next, and a user is open to learning or discovering more. And so our goal is just to make that easier. So one of the things we've done, I've talked about this earlier, is the viewable CPM. That makes it easier. We've also initiated or have what we call Tabula feed. And so this makes it a large share of voice placement, something that's more aligned with what buyers are used to buying. And so those are some of the things that we're doing to align there to make it easier for advertisers to overcome these challenges.
Great. And I think certainly you mentioned standardization there as something that's important. I think that is one of the key challenges for lots of new creative and buying opportunities. And I think when you look back at the growth of video in the last couple of years across all of Europe really now, and it is the main format, it has been that standardization of the 30-second spot that I think has really allowed a lot of agencies and brands to measure what they're doing online versus, let's say, TV and on-demand services. So I think when it comes to programmatic native, that will be one of the things that will be a tipping point to seeing that becoming used more often. If we can buy in the same way we buy everything else and measure in the same way we measure everything else. Again, if anyone has any questions, do drop them in the box on the GoToMeeting. But before we do throw it out to questions, I'm just going to ask the panel the big burning question: what do the next 12 months look like for programmatic native? I'll start with Agat to get her POV.
So related to all the points we've discussed, I think there's going to be hopefully some great evolution on the large DSP and tools existing in the market, things like CPC buying model. Hopefully in the next 12 months will be implemented everywhere, and we shouldn't stop only at this CPC, but having proper targeting optimized toward native KPIs, and give the advertisers and buyers the right tools to actually increase native programmatic. And the biggest thing the industry needs to consolidate on is the creative and standardization part, where I think the IAB organizing this webinar will be a big contributor. So hopefully there will be more synergies happening, and will make it easier for the industry to scale on programmatic native.
Great. And Terrance, what do you think the next 12 months holds for programmatic native?
I mean, speaking purely selfishly, I think it comes back to this standardization, because I'd love to see it really scaled up on all of our properties, really. But what's holding us back is just the challenges, is just, you know, just to get through all these different inventory scenarios that we see. So I'd like to see some kind of progression towards a common framework that everyone can work across. I'd also quite like to see a lot of the providers move over to a server-to-server, particularly Google Exchange bidding scenario, because I mean, one thing that we do see is that although generally the rendering of the assets perform incredibly well, things like user sync pixels and stuff drive up the latency on the page. So I'd like to see us move more over to server-to-server. But talking from BBC perspective, we want to get mobile more. We want to get native enabled more and more on mobile, because we see it as a great opportunity, particularly with things like, you know, on tablet and stuff, where you've just got this huge different proliferation of different screen sizes.
I think I would add to this is. I'll jump in now. The mobile piece.
Please jump in.
What I had written down is this is the thing I think is going to be the biggest growth over the next 12 months is in-app native. So whether this is display or video, I think we're going to see a huge uptick in that, especially with the move to ads.text for in-app. So just really exciting to see that and look at that, as I think it's a wonderful opportunity to put native into those units.
And I'll just dovetail off of the back of that, and yeah, I'll echo completely. I also think that AMP pages are lend itself particularly well, because certainly from our perspective, we see all the metrics just outperform, like, you know, the MWeb equivalent of whether it's CTR, viewable, etc., etc. So I think AMP as well is a good area of growth for native.
Yeah. I think certainly if any industry is not thinking mobile first right now, they're probably in a bit of a pickle. But certainly I think the more, you know, definitely when it comes to brands now and the opportunities, like mobile is certainly being positioned first. But I think certainly what we're hearing from an agency side for brands more and more is things like in-app opportunities become very important, because actually that's better for brand safety and quality. So if, you know, I always think in my head, I think of native advertising, I always think about, I think it's from working in the industry for 15 years, you think about branded microsites, or you think about sponsored content on another publisher's website. But I think more and more now it's becoming about how can we fit more organically into the context of some of the content we appear in the devices that consumers want. And I think mobile will not only become very important, I think we're going to have a big conversation around context generally in the industry next year. Some of the privacy laws and cookie ineffectiveness comes into play more and more. But I think that's probably for another webinar at another time. We had one question come in, and again, if anyone else wants to ask any more questions to the panelists, we do have a bit more time. And it was a question around buying relating to the effectiveness of native programmatic, namely that I think, Agat, you mentioned before, you know, a lot of native programmatic is bought on a CPC basis, but often, you know, when you're buying CPC, you can be punished in a way for having really effective creative material because your click-through rate's very high and you get less impressions. I'll throw it open to the panelists. How much do you think the buying metric affects how effective native programmatic is? Or maybe trying to change my question slightly, now I'm saying it out loud, how important do you think the way of buying is when it comes to a native programmatic approach that has to address a certain business KPI for a client?
I'll take it. So I think the buying model is, as you say, like you can adapt to anything in a way. As soon as you are clear with the KPIs of your campaign and what you really try to achieve, in a way, you could adapt to any buying model, and you can definitely do a CPM buy for native as soon as you monitor the right KPIs, which could be CPC or any type of high value action on your site. The promise of programmatic is not necessarily to go buy on CPM, and I think the industry will probably adapt to the CPC. Promise of programmatic is to actually be able to scale a lot more than via traditional, and to be able to to execute from one single platform across a lot of different SSPs or partners. So I think the industry can actually adapt to that, and there's no non-efficient way to change the model. We just need to adapt into it.
Great, thanks. Any of the other panelists have an opinion on that at all?
Well, I think it's we talked a lot about CPC, CPM buying, but CPC specifically on programmatic. The question that I have is, will DSPs do this? And will supply side partners want to do this for display, right? So is it just going to be walled off for native display? How will we manage that and come to terms with that? So for me, it's a question of native display performs really well just by the nature of where it sits. So are our efforts better spent focusing on education of headlines, creative, and branding text versus shifting the whole industry to CPC? I don't know. It's a question.
Terrance, anything you want to add, or?
Yeah, no, I suppose really it's a bit of a difficult question to answer, because from a BBC sales side perspective, we kind of generally position it as more of a premium CPM type sell. So, you know, CPC and stuff like that, that's not necessarily something that we generally entertain too much of. So I mean, a typical use, we do use it for programmatic backfill, but from a direct O perspective, we tend to use it for the promotion of branded content. So it's kind of, we always really see it as being a premium sale. And I think even when you take a look at some of the formats that we've got enabled, you know, we're talking like instant play video in the native slot, or click to play video. So I think it's around how you position it. So I mean, you know, and I think generally actually the CPMs you know, translate accordingly as well. So.
Great. Yeah, I think yeah, it's a tricky question to answer. I think it's great to hear such differing perspectives, because again, I think back to what I mentioned earlier, the native programmatic space doesn't feel like an IAB standard spot. It's something that makes a difference to the advertiser can use it any way they want, really. It can be text, it can be image, it can be video. And if you're using a contextual space to host a message that you want to host, you should be using the metric that's right for you. And I think when it comes back to the buying side of things, you know, we wouldn't go for a mass reach campaign and buy on a CPC. We'd always buy on a CPM. And I think this is an interesting conundrum how we buy, and I think it's always the buy that will help you get to your goal the best. And I think that's probably the way I'd answer that question. But certainly our panelists have given some fantastic responses from all the different sides of what matters. And I think this is certainly a space that is complicated, but complicated in a good way. And I think for me, working with brands, working with agencies, you know, we like opportunities like this where there is some flex and there is space to move. And I certainly will be watching this space closely over the next 12 months. So, guys, we're going to wrap up the call today. Just to let everyone know, there's a feedback session. You can complete at the end of this session. The recording, once it's done, will be up on the IAB website from tomorrow. And on the 24th of October, there will be a second webinar series from the Programmatic Series, Measurement and Creative Considerations. So do register for that. I'm sure there'll be some great chat just like we did today. And of course, check out the IAB website for all further events at iabeurope.eu/events. I'm going to wrap up the call now. But guys, thank you so much. Agat, Terrance, Jeremy, thank you for all your input today. Apologies for the technical issues at the start of the call, everyone, but thank you for sticking with us. It's been a really fantastic chat, and see you on the 24th.
Thank you very much.
Right, thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Cheers, guys. Bye, everyone.